Hello everyone! My name is Mansamusa and welcome back to my channel. Today we are doing part 2 of the tier list video of all units in standard play on Advanced Wars by Web. If you missed the first part of this video, I posted it about a month ago covering all ground-based units in standard play and the relevance in the various tiers that you can see on the screen. This video will be a continuation of that series and should be a bit quicker as we're just focusing on air and naval units. Just like in the first video, I will be showing the stats on screen of each individual unit, that way you can see the exact details of the units while I'm talking about them. Without further ado though, let's jump right into the video and get started on the Transport Copter. The Transport Copter in standard play is, I believe, a low C tier unit, and I know when I talked about the APC in the previous video, I rated it as a D tier because your enemy can see you build the transport, right? And this takes out a lot of the punch of it. In Fog, because you can't see the transport being built, it is much more viable because it allows you to get greedy opens without always having to face retaliation from recons and tanks and so on and so forth. But in standard play, when your opponent can see you make these builds, they can respond with appropriate aggression and really shut down any type of greedy opening that you do. The only difference really though between the Transport Copter and the APC that makes the Transport Copter distinctly better is really actually three different things. Number one, it is an aerial unit as opposed to a ground unit, so it doesn't get affected by movement terrain at all. This allows it to get over challenging movement types such as mountains, rivers, sea tiles, all things that either land-based units have a very tough time going through or can't get through at all. Well, actually, it can't get through any of those, but it could get through something like a forest. A transport copter could get through something like a forest much easier than an APC could because it pays one less movement cost. So number one, it's better overall movement than the APC. Number two, it is built from an airport as opposed to a base. This allows your unit count to stay up, not sacrificing spending a unit on the APC. This is a kind of a smaller thing in the short term, but overall in the long term, you always want to have higher unit count than your opponent. So being able to still build an infantry from your base while also building the transport copter gives it a huge edge over the APC. The last important thing about the transport copter to mention over the APC is that it is actually necessary on most maps where there is specific islands that are hard to reach. So if you think of a map like Cycles to Guyana or Seashore Ocarina, I believe it's called, both those maps have tiny little islands with a few properties, a comm tower, sometimes it has a port, various properties that you want to capture if you have some space because you're already winning a bit or you feel comfortable in a Wally type game forming, and you want to get these properties, in which case you pretty much have to build a transport copter to get to them. Your other option is something like a black boat, which is more expensive, so it's much more beneficial to build a transport copter. And in those cases, the transport copter situationally becomes like an A or an S tier unit because it's just something you have to build to get the income, comm towers, whatever that you want. But overall, it's just better than an APC basically on all marks, and for that reason, it sneaks out of D tier into low C tier. Moving now to the Battlecopter. The Battlecopter is a low S tier unit. And the reason why I say it's low S tier as opposed to just pure S tier is because it is one of the units you will see most in the game, right? Along with tanks, anti-air artillery. Battlecopters are one of those most produced units. But I don't think it is as versatile as those other units, and for that reason, I think it's low S. Let me kind of explain my reasoning a bit here. Obviously, the main advantage of the Battlecopter is what we basically talked about with the Transport Copter, which is you can save unit count by building Battlecopter, right? You always want to have a higher unit count than your opponent. It's probably the most important statistic. So being able to build, 3 infantry and a Battlecopter in response to your opponent's 2 tank and an infantry can be very strong, right? Because the Battlecopter counters the tanks and you're getting more infantry out, which will help you in the late game. But the problem with the Battlecopter is that it's not always the best on certain maps, right? Something like a tank or an anti-air is going to be pretty much good no matter what map you're on. But on certain maps, when airports are really far stuck in the back, or you have to bust down pipe seams to get to them, there are these situations where Battlecopters are just not as good. The other really big downside for the Battlecopter is that there's a good amount of COs actually that don't utilize Battlecopters as strongly as something like tank or anti-air. I'll just rattle off a few off the top of my head. the commanders like Max, Lash, and Drake all have issues with aerial units, and specifically battlecopters, over those tank and anti-air. For Drake, his aerial units are just weaker. For Lash, she doesn't get any bonuses for any of her extra firepower on air units. And for Max, they don't get any of the movement bonuses that are applied to his ground-based vehicles. So a lot of the extra hidden benefits of CO powers and whatnot are often not felt by the battlecopter. Really, the only common COs that you'll see utilizing battlecopters better than most other COs is Eagle and Sensei. And Sensei you're only going to see in high funds tier 1. So it's a very niche spot for him. But overall, they're not getting these other bonuses that most other units, like tanks and anti-airs, would get. Throw in Jess in there as well. That's another great example of a commander that gives those bonuses to the ground units, but not to the battlecopter. The other main reason why battlecopters are just not as good is because they get bodied too easily. In the triangle unit that we talked about in the previous video, I mentioned how low HP anti-airs, like a 4 or 5 HP anti-air, can basically still decimate a battlecopter. And that's really a huge drawback for the battlecopters, especially because they're the most expensive of the triangle units, right? They're 9K. So they're a heavy investment of your actual pooled resources. And when that can die just by you having a few straggling anti-airs around, it can be very annoying. It's for this reason that I really, if I am going to start building battlecopters, I tend to do a battlecopter chain. I tend to do 2 or 3 or 4 because you really want to have a scenario where you have a win condition, right? Where if you eliminate your opponent's anti-air or just even severely weaken them, the battlecopter can finish off a weakened anti-air to an extent, like a 3 or 4 HP anti-air. If the battlecopter gives the first strike, the battlecopter can win that engagement, and then the rest of your battlecopters can come in and start attacking your opponent's tanks. So it's really something that I think you either dive into fully, build a lot of battlecopters, or you pretty much kind of ignore on certain maps, right? There's not really a lot of scenarios where you'll want to build one battlecopter for the entire game. Like that, if you're gonna build battlecopters, if you think battlecopters are good, you're gonna spam them. If you think battlecopters are bad, you're probably not gonna build that much. So you'll see people have different opinions, right, on the map. Some people will build battlecopters on a map, while the other person's like, I think battlecopters are bad, and we'll just build anti-air. And you basically see who's right and who's wrong just by that interaction of who's building what. For all these reasons, though, the fact that they can get bullied pretty hard in the triangle, they don't get the advantages of some of the other COs. They're the most expensive of the triangle units. Battlecopters are still an amazing unit, amazing counter to tanks, and they're still an S tier unit. They're just the bottom of S tier. Moving on to the fighter. The fighter is a C tier unit. It's a unit that you're really not going to see too often in most of Advanced Force by Web, and that's just because a lot of these aerial units past the fighter, so the fighter, the bomber, the stealth, are just very, very expensive to the extent that they're not often built on most maps, especially in the early to mid game, right? They're just such a heavy investment. I mean, we're talking basically the price of a Neo tank for a unit that can only attack other air units, right? So it's very situational. The anti-air really does its job better than the fighter does. It's just such a heavy investment that you're really not going to see it, except for one case that I'll talk about quickly. Before I do, though, it's important to mention that while the fighter does seem better than the anti-air because it has better range, because it can be built on an airport instead of a base, some of the reasons that we talked about before, the raw cost of it means that you really should not be building fighters if your opponent just has battlecopters out. If they just have battlecopters out, just build anti-air. It's going to be way superior. That being said, fighters do have an important use case, and that is if your opponent ever builds a bomber, sort of. You can still get away with just building 2 anti-air to counter a bomber, but most importantly, a stealth. If your opponent ever builds a stealth fighter, the only way you can take that down is with a fighter or stealth fighter of your own. So it's a guaranteed build that you have to do. You have to respond to it because the stealth fighter can slowly whittle away your army. And it requires that build of either a fighter or stealth, and the fighter is the cheaper of those 2 options. The important thing to realize about these fighter versus stealth interactions is you can never be airport locked. If you get airport locked on a map like Shadows Chase You Endlessly, for example, and your opponent builds a stealth, they've won the game, right? Because if they're locking down your airport with an anti-air, you can never build that fighter or stealth of your own, and they basically have just automatically won the map. And there's a few maps like this in the pool, so you have to be aware of this. You really do not want to get your airport locked. And in those cases, that's when you would see the stealth come out by your opponent. For all these reasons, though, the fact that it is overly expensive and very narrow in its use cases, except in very necessary cases where you have to build it, the fighter is a C tier unit. Moving on to the bomber. The bomber is A tier unit, although I would say probably the lowest A tier unit, maybe even like a B plus tier unit. The reason why the the bomber is just not as good as some of the other units is basically down to cost, right? It's a $22,000 unit, so it's the same cost of a Neo tank. And while it has the advantages that a battlecopter would have over a tank, right, where you build it from the airport, oftentimes you're really just not going to have 25k, which is what a bomber and 3 infantry build would be. There's very few maps in standard play where you're going to have that type of money, so you'd have to be saving up for this type of play. And you're really only going to be building a bomber in very niche instances, and those instances where you're going to build it is responding to opponent's neotank, right? Because it counters your opponent's neotank, and also doing so in a way where your opponent doesn't have a lot of anti-air out, right? Because the anti-air, a 7k unit, can, if it gets the first strike, basically destroy the bomber in one shot, wiping out $22,000 of value. The bomber is an incredibly risky unit, right? If you ever lose it, it's a huge loss to your economy, especially if you lose it to an anti-air. So it's a unit you have to position very carefully and not be too reckless with. So it's a higher skill ceiling unit in that way. The really important strategy that happens with the bomber that I think is relevant to talk about is actually targeting anti-air with your bomber. And this is kind of a similar idea to I've talked about before of something like targeting anti-air with your battlecopters, right? If you can finish off anti-air with your battlecopters, it can be incredibly destructive because it allows you to have free reign on the rest of the battlefield. The same goes with the bombers. If the bombers can get a first strike on an anti-air and then be in no other danger from other anti-airs in the area, that is a huge advantage, right? So if the bomber gets the first strike, you're absolutely winning the engagement, or you're going to have a massive positional lead. So it's for this reason that it's kind of a dice roll, right? If you play it correctly, you'll get a huge lead. If your opponent plays it correctly and you blunder, you're really putting yourself behind. So it's kind of an all or nothing type gamble in that way. But with proper use cases, it's an incredibly strong unit, not something that you should be scared to build, something that you'll pretty much only see in the late game, to be fair. But overall, a strong unit, low A tier, maybe high B tier, somewhere in that area. Next up on the list, we have the Stealth Fighter. And the Stealth Fighter is just an incredibly complex unit for most new players. And honestly, I think it's a B tier unit. It's situationally good, right? Its main use case, like I've talked about before, is if you can shut down your opponent's airport, building a stealth is pretty much an automatic win condition. It becomes S tier at that point because your opponent can't fight against it. But overall, as a unit, it's not that great, right? It only has 60 fuel, and when it goes into stealth mode where it can't be attacked by other units other than fighter and stealths of your own, it burns 5 fuel a day, which means that it's going to run out of fuel very quickly and can crash if you're not careful. And that's really the main downside of the stealth, right? Is that it's not just a $24,000 unit, it's a $29,000 unit, because in addition to the stealth fighter, you pretty much have to buy an APC as well to constantly refuel it. So it's a huge investment of resources, and honestly, it does pretty middling to mediocre damage, about the strength of a battlecopter, maybe slightly stronger than that against certain units. It's for this reason, it's a very high skill ceiling unit, I would say. To properly use stealths to their maximum potential, you have to be very knowledgeable of the game and how to manage your fuel and manage your opponent's CO powers and other situations like that. But in terms of raw strength, it's nowhere near overpowered. And I think, honestly, if you're ever building a stealth, it's probably a mistake. You probably don't have the ability to use it to its full potential, and are going to be better off building something else with your $29,000 that you're not investing into the stealth and APC combo. At the end of the day, it's not worse than the recon or the mech or some of these other units below it, but it's definitely not nearly as strong as anything above it, like the artillery, the medium tank, the bomber. Moving now to the Black Bomb, the easiest of all units to rank on this tier list because it is banned. The Black Bomb is kind of a crazy unit, and I'll talk about it a little bit. I believe it's a $30,000 unit, if I remember correctly, and it explodes in a radius of, I believe, 4 to 5. I actually don't even remember because this unit doesn't get built. and it deals 5 HP of damage to everything in that radius. That I do know. And obviously, if this was allowed in game, it's pretty broken. It's basically the power of something like Sturm CO power or Von Bolt Super CO power. It can be absolutely devastating if it was allowed on the battlefield. And it would pretty much break certain maps. So for this reason, it's obviously banned on pretty much, I think, every single map in standard play. But you will see it sometimes in casual play on bigger maps with like 7 or 8 players, and in those cases, it can be a very fun unit. But for standard play, it's banned. You'll never see it. Moving now to the naval units, starting with the Black Boat. The Black Boat is a high D tier unit. Just like some of the other transports we talked about, it's less powerful in standard play than it is in Fog and some other matches. The main advantage of the Black Boat is that it can carry 2 infantry units as opposed to 1, like the transport or the APC. And it's for this reason that it's much stronger, because it allows you to get infantry pushes on a weak side on certain maps. And on most maps, you'll actually see pre-deployed Black Boats in these cases, because the cost of the Black Boat, 7,500, is very prohibitive. That's the main reason why it's a D tier unit and not anything higher. 7,500, a tank. Just build a tank. It's almost always going to be better than the Black Boat if you're actually having to build the Black Boat in these cases. And on certain maps, like I talked about previously with islands, the transport copter is just strictly better. It's cheaper and does the exact same job. You don't need to be sending 2 infantry over to those islands. One will get the job done over time, and it'll be much more efficient. The last thing to mention about the Black Boat that you'll see a lot in standard play is I talked about how there'll be pre-built Black Boats on certain maps to help you transport infantry. There is often also pre-built Black Boats on your HQ, and you might be wondering, why is this? The main reason for this is to stop HQ rushes, right? In order to take down the Black Boat, it is a very sturdy unit. You basically need multiple artillery shellings or battlecopters over 3 or 4 turns, and combined with tanks and stuff like that. It's a very sturdy unit in this ways, and it stops HQ rushes on most maps from being kind of a cheesy strat. So you'll often see the Black Boats built on HQs as a pre-deployed unit for this way, and it's very effective in that. The last important thing to talk about the Black Boat that elevates it slightly is its power to repair units, right? This is the revolutionary tactic about the cartridge games that it comes from. For the cost of 1/10 of the unit value that you are repairing, it'll repair 1 HP. So it's kind of like a mini city in that way, because the city does 2 HP for 2/10 of the unit's value. And this can become very useful in certain situations, especially around your HQ. For example, if you're max and you get a tank engagement against your opponent that goes 9-4, repairing your tank back up to full HP can be a very strong choice if you're going up against a weaker unit, a weaker CO that can't 2-hit a full HP tank. So the Black Boat has real value in those cases in its ability to repair units. There's oftentimes in these scenarios where you're having units around your HQ that having your Black Boat still standing before it goes down can allow your walls around your HQ to hold on just a little bit longer through repairs than it would have previously, and gives it that little extra benefit. But again, in these cases, you would never want to build a Black Boat to get these benefits. That repair functionality is not worth it, because you still have to pay for those repairs. It's just a nice thing to have in certain cases when it's pre-built for you. With all that being said, Black Boat, easy D tier, definitely not anything higher, but I will say better than the APC. Moving now to the Lander. The Lander is the top of trash tier. It's the only transport unit I'm going to rank below D tier, and the reason for that is very simple. It's its cost. 12,000 funds is just way, way, way too much to pay for any transport unit. The main advantage of the Lander, as opposed to some of its other transport counterparts, is it's not restricted to just carrying infantry. Landers can carry vehicles like tanks and anti-air as well, and this can make it very strong on certain maps that are more like island hoppy and so on, versus a big central landmass that you'd be fighting on. But in the standard map pool, these island hoppy type maps are very rare. You'll basically, I can't think of one off the top of my head where it's set up like this, where there's not shoals in between the islands that allows you to move freely between them. So the landers just don't really have a lot of use case in Global League standard play. There are certain maps I've seen before where there's a pre-built lander, which you have to use very tactically in that way, because if your opponent also has a pre-built lander, you need to know how to use the unit to its maximum potential to really get your units to your weak side, because that's often the purpose of it, is to get your units to the weak side in a smart way to counter your opponent on the map, because that's what the mapper is building it around. It's building it around having the lander and getting your units out to the front lines quicker. So in this way, the lander is kind of a high skill ceiling unit, because if it's been built for you, they want you to use it very tactically. But for yourself, if you're ever considering a lander, just don't. $12,000 to pay for it is just way too much. For that price, you could get, tank, recon, infantry on all your bases and have a much, much better build than building a lander. For all these reasons, it's trash tier. Really never build it. But if one's built for you, you better knows how to use it, because the mapper is counting on you to use it tactically. Moving now to the cruiser, and I'm actually going to rank the cruiser and sub at the same time and put them both in the trash tier. The cruiser, sub, and battleship form their own triangle of counter units, just like we have on land with the tank, anti-air, and battlecopter, but you'll pretty much never see the naval version of this triangle, just because these units are way, way too expensive. And in the case of the cruiser and sub, it's absolutely not worth it. These units are trash for basically two reasons. In the case of the cruiser, anti-airs do their job much better, just like every other anti-air unit in the game. And the cruiser also gets bodied by its main thing it's supposed to counter. If a battlecopter gets the first strike on the cruiser, I think it does something like 5 damage to it, which is 9,000 funds worth. It basically earns in the battlecopter immediately, and the battlecopter is going to win that engagement in the long term if it gets the first strike. So the cruiser is just a horrible unit in that way. You'll pretty much literally never see it in standard play. The only time I think I've ever seen a cruiser been built is on Sahara, where the airport is more vulnerable to that kind of middle seas that are available towards the middle island. And even in that case, this was a low, like 1,000 level type game, and I don't think it was the best play by my opponent. Just because, like I said, it's way too much money to invest, and it's a super weak unit. Moving to the sub, it's the same story all over again, but even worse. It's 20,000 funds as opposed to 18,000 funds, and the only thing it can attack is other naval units, which are going to be incredibly rare to begin with. Its main counter is against battleships, and we'll get into battleships in a second here, but most of the time, really well-positioned battleships aren't actually going to be moving. They're going to be staying on the port, either base locking something or protecting themselves from actually being base locked. So you're never going to be actually building a sub to counteract someone's battleship, except on very few, pretty much zero maps in standard play. It's much more of reality in high funds, but even in those cases, you'll want to attack battleships with something more versatile, like a bomber, which can attack not only the battleships, but other units as well. It's just way too niche of a unit to be spending this much money on, and it's for that reason that it's trashed here. Moving to the battleship. The battleship is the only naval unit escaping the trash tier and is going into D tier. And as I pull up the stats of the battleship, you'll see that it's incredibly expensive, right? It's a $28,000 unit, but there is an actual use case for saving up to a battleship as opposed to something like a mega tank. And the reason why you might want to save up for a battleship is because it is one of the only units in the game that can actually base lock your opponent or prevent yourself from being base locked. There are many maps in standard play where you'll have well-positioned ports on the map that allow you to do this. And in these cases, building a battleship to either severely threaten your enemy, for basically stopping them to have a base entirely, or protecting yourself from that exact thing happening to you, can be a very effective strategy and lead to game-winning pushes in the long term. Obviously, though, this is the most all-in strategy you could possibly do. $28,000 is a crazy amount to spend, and if you have certain map dynamics where your opponent can just go around your battleship and attack other parts of the map, it's not a smart move at all, right? Because like in other ranged units, the counter to other ranged units is basically just outmaneuver them and go around them. That is especially the case in a pretty stationary unit that is trapped in just the water, like the battleship. It is for this reason that the battleship is situationally very good and maybe even a higher tier unit like a B or an A. But in other situations where your opponent can just go around it, it's trash tier just along the other naval units. So it's a bit hard to rank overall, but I think low D tier is a fair rating for it because of the game altering pushes that it can allow for. I'll also throw in quickly that you'll see battleships much more often in high funds, like I talked about with the other naval units, both because you have more money and because in high funds, naval maps are much more common. Moving on to the very last unit in the game, we have the carrier. And the carrier, like its brother the Megatank, is going into the Year 2 Broke tier. At the cost of 30,000 funds, it has a place in high funds maps where you get 2k per city. But in standard play, 30,000 is just way, way, way too much. Even the highest income maps in the pool, I believe, are around 24 to 25k. So you'll never have enough income to ever build the carrier without saving. And its use case as essentially a water missile, but better, obviously, it has more range than the missiles, is just not valuable enough to be significant on most maps. So if I was going to rate it, give an actual rank, it would probably be like somewhere between C and D, but you're just never going to see it in standard play because it's just way too expensive. With all that being said, we have wrapped up the tier list of all units in Advanced Borders by Web and their relevance in standard play. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Matsumosa, and remember, if you want to get to 1300 MMR, build the missiles. Bye, guys.